Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's REL Mid-Atlantic webinar on the topic of educator roles in quality classroom interactions. This is the 8th webinar in our Teacher Effectiveness Series for 2013, and we're glad you are all able to join us today for this exciting presentation. I'm Elizabeth Greniger, and I'll be facilitating today's event. With me, I have Dr. Drew Jitomer from Rutgers University. He'll be presenting on the topic of classroom interactions. At this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter for today. Dr. Drew Jitomer is, as I said, from Rutgers University. He is the Rose and Nicholas DiMarzo Chair in Education at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education. His work focuses on constructs related to teaching quality, the quality of classroom interactions, teacher knowledge, teacher beliefs, and student achievement. He's currently co-editing the American Educational Research Association Handbook of Research on Teaching. He was formerly a researcher and senior vice president of research at ETS, where he led the Understanding Teaching Quality. He's done research on and development of assessments for the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards and research on assessments for students from the perspective of developing assessment methods that are directly related to instruction and learning. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Drew.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for attending the webinar. Teacher effectiveness and its evaluation is on everyone's agenda, and I know that it's having an impact on everyone who is part of this webinar, particularly those folks that are in the schools. We've moved from research to practice very rapidly, and while we've learned a great deal from research efforts that have been carried out this last decade, we have a lot more to learn as these evaluation efforts and policies move into practice. So we'll try to cover a good bit of ground today and give you a sense of what we've been learning about classroom interactions in carrying out a number of studies involving classroom observations. Now, the work I described is the product of a collaboration of many individuals. PIs on these projects include the individuals listed on the slide, but there are many other colleagues at these and other institutions who all have contributed to this work. The key to this work, as well as the immense support and cooperation we got from those who have actually developed observation protocols. And that includes Charlotte Danielson, the University of Virginia colleagues listed here, Pam Grossman at Stanford, and Heather Hill at Harvard. I also want to thank the 3 foundations who provided the financial support that made this work possible. The W.T. Grant, Spencer, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations all have shown an unwavering commitment to support the generation of new knowledge around the measurement and improvement of teaching. I'd also like to thank many teachers and administrators who collectively contributed to the findings and insights I'll share with you today. And none of this work could have been done without their generous cooperation. Now, the title of this talk is very broad, and I want to circumscribe it a little bit. It would be impossible to talk about teachers' roles in classroom interactions in less than 2 hours. It's far too rich and multifaceted. What we're really talking about is the extent to which we can make reasonable judgments about a teacher's contribution to effective classroom practice. When what is effective is defined by some model of teaching and then judged by the use of a protocol that is guided by that theory. I'm going to share with you some technical data and terminology, but such information is not just something we construct for researchers and policymakers. Instead, such information provides insight into how we understand teaching, learning, and leadership, roles that are successful instruction. We want to do far more than just sort teachers into those who are more or less effective. We want to develop meaningful information that teachers and administrators can act on to improve what happens in classrooms. I also deliberately changed the title in an important way. Originally, it was titled Teachers' Roles in Classroom Interactions, but I changed it to Educators' Roles for a few reasons. First, the judgment about the effectiveness of a teacher in a classroom is only partially a function of what the teacher does in that classroom. It is also a function of curriculum, policies, and the students who are in that classroom. But evaluation also depends on who is observing and how they observe. In research studies, we've used peer teachers, but in schools, these educators are often administrators in the schools. And there are others involved in education who also influence both how teachers teach and how observers observe, and those are the policymakers. We'll talk about all of these today. Now, I think it's clear to most of us how we got to where we are, and I know you've heard some of this before in other seminars, so I'll be brief. Prior to the recent increased activity around teacher evaluation was deeply flawed, as described well in the Widget Effect Report, among others. And while there are exceptions, such as Montgomery County in Maryland and their PAR program, or the longstanding system in Cincinnati, the evaluations, which often focused on observations, could overwhelmingly be described as, one, consisting of checklists that capture superficial aspects of teaching, such as the presence of objectives on the board or waiting enough time for students to think. Consisting of brief and or rare observations, rarely linked to formal learning opportunities. 3, providing feedback about one's performance that was often positive, did not identify areas, and in general did not help teachers become stronger teachers. And last, describing the vast majority of teaching happening across the nation's classrooms as satisfactory. Now, as I'm sure you've heard from other presentations, the new teacher evaluation systems being put into place across the country are intended to have two purposes. The first is to support human capital decisions. Who should get tenure and who should be terminated? How should teachers be compensated on the basis of performance on evaluations? The second purpose is to support professional development. Each of these systems has multiple components. For example, measures of teachers' contributions to student learning, such as value-added estimates, student growth percentiles, and student learning objectives, surveys of student beliefs, and administrators' observations of teaching practice. I'm going to focus on observation protocols, in part because they are often used by practitioners and researchers alike as the instrument that is most likely to provide insights that can improve teaching, for they are the most direct measures of classroom interactions. The importance of classroom interactions has long been a subject of study. A rich research tradition examined the relationship of teaching behaviors to student achievement. And not surprisingly, environments in which students spend most of their time actively engaged in learning activities are more successful than classrooms in which there is much off-task behavior. Classrooms in which the teachers provide clear guidance and explanation also have been associated with more successful instruction. More recent research has shed light, often through observation, on the complex nature of interactions between teachers and students and how such interactions shape the classroom environment. For example, research carried out by Bob Pianta and colleagues has focused on interactions that provide emotional support as well as those that provide instructional support. This general framework was developed for classrooms for younger children, but has now been applied to classrooms through secondary school. And the key takeaway from this research is that this is not an either-or situation. Classrooms need to be well organized. They need to be emotionally supportive and instructionally supportive, for all three contribute to an effective educational environment for students. Now, to gain more accurate information on what teachers do to help students learn, classroom observation systems are being created in many states and districts with the hopes of overcoming the shortcomings of the evaluation systems described in the Widget Report. According to Pianta, classroom observations could be an important tool for accountability-driven measures of teacher quality. They provide a standard way of measuring and noting teachers' strengths and weaknesses. Overwhelmingly, these new observation systems use standardized observation rubrics to look not only at teacher behaviors, but also the quality of student interactions as well. For example, if we want to understand the effectiveness of questioning in a lesson, it is not enough to attend to the questions the teacher asks. It's also critical to attend to how students take up and respond to those questions. So the information obtained from classroom observations is expected to guide professional development plans and inform human capital decisions. Elizabeth, I think I will turn this to you now.
Great, thanks, Drew. At this time, we'd really like to find out a little bit more from the participants about the type of class, the particular actions that you may be seeing in your school or district as part of the observation system, and tell us a brief little snippet about why those particular classroom interactions are included. You'll see a poll come up onto the screen now. So I'm seeing a range of responses: student engagement, understanding of content, teacher questioning strategies. Higher order questioning. See some interesting ones: student ownership of the lesson. Drew, feel free to jump in and discuss any of the responses you're seeing come in.
Sure. I mean, it certainly seems like there's an awful lot of focus on essentially student discourse, student engagement, discussion, the kinds of things that we'll talk about that sometimes are missing in lots of classrooms. So these seem to be worthwhile things to focus on.
It's interesting because I see a few references to behavior management or classroom management, but I thought I would see more of that as part of the observational system.
Right. What's interesting here is so much of the focus is on students, which is, I think, represents a significant sea change from where we were 20, 30 years ago, when I suspect the focus would very much be on what teachers do and the actions that they take and their behaviors. And it's a much more student-centered orientation.
This is great. I see definitely a wide range of interactions that are being attended to. And I think as we move along in the presentation today, the contributions you all as participants can make to this conversation, both through the questions about Content Box and in our future polls, you can talk to us a lot more about how interactions are playing out in your schools and classrooms. But at this time, actually we have quite a few people, I guess, still typing, so we want to give you all a chance to jot down your thoughts on this. We see several references to assessment and how teachers are assessing on an ongoing basis, checking for understanding during the lesson.
Mm-hmm. Well, this actually is a nice segue into much of the research, many of the research findings that we're seeing in terms of what teachers are able to execute and what people are able to see in terms of practice and where schools really need to develop their expertise.
Right, and I think there's a lot of overlap in a lot of the comments we saw that, many of these types of interactions are linked and, one comes with the other. So it's all part of this bigger system of instruction that's happening in the classroom. All right, well, at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Drew, so you can move on with the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. So in this section, we're going to focus on some protocols we've used in our studies and how these produce accurate, or actually the extent to which they produce accurate and reliable information about the level of teaching skill the teacher demonstrates in classroom observations. In order to make judgments about classroom interactions, there is a need for a coherent system and not just an instrument or protocol to conduct observations. And so I want to focus on system because the meaning of scores adheres in the whole system. In addition to the rubrics, there are extensive training materials that include descriptions of the scales, samples of teaching that illustrate different aspects of teaching at different score points. Individuals become qualified to score observations through certification processes that warrant that a set of scores are reasonably accurate. During scoring, there can be checks on the accuracy and reliability of scores so that attention can be given to those observers who need it. Because there's always error associated with this kind of judgmental process, attempts are made to conduct good measurement by ensuring that different observers see the same teacher at different points during the school year, so that every teacher is observed multiple times by multiple observers. Systems also specify how long a teacher is observed before a set of scores are assigned, and these observation segments can vary substantially across different observation systems. So all these things matter. And when I say observation system, we are referring to all of this. I'll not describe a great deal about these systems, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A. Now, a quick word about the quality of information we want to obtain from any measurement instrument. First, if we're going to use these instruments to judge people and make judgments that have consequences, it's important that judgments are based on accurate data. If the data is not both accurate and reliable, the changes we hope to occur will not happen. Now, with classroom observations, it is important that observers have a shared understanding of what constitutes good teaching practice. If observers that go inside a school system cannot agree on what they see, this does not necessarily imply that the measure is inadequate. Low agreement may reflect more fundamental issues about how educators think and talk about teaching. So what do we mean by accuracy and reliability in operational terms? For accuracy, the idea is that if I am an observer and I go in and see Ms. Jones teach and score her on the questioning and feedback she used during the lesson, my score should match a master observer's score. We should both agree that the questioning was proficient. If I think it's proficient and the master observer watches and she says, no, that's basic, I am not using the scoring scales accurately. And historically, accuracy has been a big problem in education. And as we've begun to read about evaluation in almost every other field, we've found this problem is not unique to teaching. By reliability, we mean the degree to which scores are free from influences, such as who gave the scores, when they were given, and what was being taught to which classroom of students. Scores are not meaningful if we cannot generalize them to a larger universe of instances than the particular lesson we observed. And now that you have a sense of some of these issues we're focusing on and why we focus, what have we found? What are the factors that can influence the quality and validity of observation scores? So drawing on studies from 4 studies in a number of large districts, we find first that observers vary in the consistency of their judgments and struggle to accurately and consistently judge aspects of teaching that are not organizational and behavioral. They get more accurate over time, but remain below acceptable levels of reliability. And observers judge teachers similarly, regardless if they score using video or by watching the lesson live. And the struggles observers face are systemic. Principals don't agree more with each other than they do with master observers, and teachers and observers do not agree on the quality of the instructional aspects of their practice. Now I'm going to talk about 4 studies that have explored observation instruments and protocols. The first study collected data from 3 large school systems in the same metropolitan area and included 458 middle school math and ELA teachers. 4 lessons for each teacher were video recorded and scored. 2 of those lessons from each teacher were also scored live. The second study involved the classrooms from each of 82 middle school and high school algebra teachers from a single large urban fringe district that serves about 90% non-white students. Each teacher was observed live 4 or 5 times, and each of the lessons were video recorded and also scored later by separate raters. The third study was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Measures of Effective Teaching Project, or MET. This large study that included over 3,000 teachers from 6 urban school systems teaching math and ELA in grades 4 to 9, as well as biology in grade 9. Teachers were again rated on 4 video recorded lessons. The final study is one being directed by Courtney Bell at ETS, and I'm citing the work of her and her colleagues. They are focusing on nearly 800 principals taking part in their district's revised evaluation system, using a modern protocol developed in the district but patterned after Danielson. Now, across these studies, we consider multiple rating instruments. The Classroom Assessment Scoring System, or CLAS, and Danielson's Framework for Teaching are both designed for use with classes of any subject area, and we also and grade level. And we also studied 2 subject-specific protocols: the MQI for mathematics and Plato for language arts. As we noted, we studied principles using this locally developed variant of the Danielson framework. The protocols for using these measures are similar. Raters observe a segment of a lesson, and the length of that segment varies across instruments. They take notes while observing. They would then stop and score the teaching on the segment on each of multiple dimensions. And every rater scored all the dimensions. After scoring, they would return to observing for the next segment of the lesson and repeat until the lesson was over. Now, I'm going to focus here on the generic instruments, CLAS and Danielson. And these instruments set a research-based bar for what we expect to see in classrooms. All the instruments have a similar structure. Teaching is broken down into large domains of activities or classroom interactions. Each domain is then defined by multiple dimensions, 3 to 4 in CLAS and 5 or 6 in Danielson. CLAS has 3 domains. Emotional support, that involves creating an environment that is sensitive to the student and provides a positive and engaging climate. Instructional support focuses on the quality of academic instruction. And classroom organization focuses on classroom behavior and operational management. Each is scored on a 7-point scale. Danielson includes 2 domains scored during direct observation of teaching. Each dimension is scored on a 4-point scale. The classroom environment domain covers similar dimensions to CLAS's emotional and classroom organization domains, and instruction includes dimensions consistent with the instructional support domain of CLAS. Now, many of you are likely familiar with Danielson, but less so with CLAS, so let me share a few key points. This is one of the dimensions from the CLAS instrument, analysis and problem solving, a dimension that is part of the instructional support domain. At the top is a general description of the dimension, along with indicators, which describe the primary contributors to the dimension. Within each indicator are a set of elements. And as an observer, one is supposed to find evidence relevant to each of those elements and then give a tentative score of low, middle, or high for each indicator. Those are then considered by the observer as they assign a score of 1 to 7 on the overall scale. Note that only scores of 1, 4, and 7 have anchor descriptions associated with them. The protocol also includes richer elaborations that are designed to help observers understand the different expectations associated with each score range of high, mid, and low. So here's what we find. Starting with the class instrument, the figure shows the overall average score for teachers on each of the instrument domains. Scores in emotional and instructional support are middling and do not describe impressive instruction. Rote teaching dominates the conversations. Students are asked simple factual questions with limited probing. We see that classes are generally well-behaved and productive as classroom organization is relatively high. So to the questions raised in the poll right before, we don't see a terribly large amount of enriched sort of discussioning and questioning and answering cycles inside most of these classrooms. The story on Danielson is similar. Teaching is mediocre on both domains. Classroom environment is higher, and within it, the classroom management is especially high, along with creating an environment of respect and rapport. Managing classroom behavior and control is high on both. And across all these studies, we saw that classrooms were more alike than they were different. Yes, there were differences, but we saw very few teachers at different ends of a scale for a given dimension. If we think about the kinds of reasoning and depth of understanding that are being called for in the Common Core standards, the relatively low level of instruction that we observe suggests that we have a significant challenge before us. It is unlikely that the current state of general teaching practice will support attainment of the Common Core standards. But what are we to make about factors that might influence the quality of classroom interactions? Are we just looking at the teacher, or does it matter who the students are? To begin to look at this, we can examine differences in classroom interactions when the same subject matter is taught, but classes include students with different academic skills. In TUC, the study of algebra, we looked at school and high school classrooms in a single district. In this district, as with so many others, students who take algebra in the 8th grade are generally stronger students than those who take it in the 9th grade. And this slide shows the class S score differences by domain across the two groups of classrooms. We see that the middle school scores are substantially higher than for the high school. And yet on every measure we looked at, whether it was experience or teacher test scores, there were no apparent differences between middle and high school teachers. So this kind of finding raises the question of exactly what are we measuring? We're observing the quality of classroom interactions, but to what extent is that quality of those interactions controlled solely by the teacher? Certainly we can think of other factors, such as curriculum, and most especially the students themselves, which may also affect the quality of interactions and not be under the sole control of the teacher. Elizabeth, are you going to take this at this point?
I sure will. Thanks, Drew. Actually, before we start on this, it looks like we do have a question from Rita. She wants you to explain that last slide again. So would you mind kind of stating that or talking about it in a slightly different way?
Sure. So we have these two groups of students, classrooms, the middle school, where the students have been more academically successful than those who take algebra in the high school. And when we look at the overall quality of those classroom interactions, we see significant differences in the quality of the classroom interactions. So the question is this because we have substantially different quality of teachers in those classrooms, or is it that the teaching may be different for a whole other sets of reasons? And you can do sort of the thought experiment and say, well, what if we move those middle school teachers into the high school and move the high school teachers into the middle school? Would we all of a sudden see the same quality of interactions in the high school that we see in the middle school right now? And while we didn't do that experiment, we can look at all sorts of other indicators of the teacher's proficiency, and we didn't see any differences at all. And so we're seeing this different teaching going on, and we see the teachers actually behaving somewhat differently, but it's not clear exactly why that is and whether this is sort of a stable trait of the teacher that carries over with them to any classroom they're in, or whether there's interaction between the teacher and the students. And so it could be in expectations, it could be in what the students contribute to the classroom. There's all sorts of things that can affect those interactions. And so our models that sort of are trying to say what is the teacher effectiveness may not be actually fully capturing what we mean by teaching effectiveness. And when we look at actually the learning outcomes, and we look at sort of the value added and how much they grow on tests of algebra from the beginning of the class to the end, we actually see that the middle school students are learning more also. So in middle school, we have classes that seem to experience better teaching. The kids learn more. But the question is it the teacher as the source of is the teacher the determinant of that gain and of those interactions, or are we really talking about the classroom as an entity that makes it harder to pick out exactly what the contributing factor is to this better teaching and better learning?
Thanks, Drew. I think that's helpful. And, I'm seeing some other kind of follow-up questions to that, and I think essentially you summarized the point that while we can't directly point to it's the teacher and something the teacher's doing, there's potentially a combination of factors that contribute to what's happening in a classroom that might answer this question.
Right, and I see Della asked a question about the classroom school environments. These schools were all in the same district, so the middle schools were feeders into the high schools. These were, essentially the same kids. It wasn't as if we were in two different communities. So sometimes there's issues of sorting, and people worry about selection effects when we compare these different levels. But this was all sort of a group of people that went from one level to the other within the same community.
That's good. I think that certainly is helpful and provides a lot more context for that.
Great.
So now what we'd like everyone to do is think about those class domains that were just discussed on the previous slides, and think we're going to put up two different questions, but I'm going to address them both here first. Which of the class domains would be most difficult for observers to judge, in your opinion? And then which of the Danielson framework domains would be the most difficult for observers to judge? And some of you may have experience with one or the other of those observation protocols. So it looks like for class, about close to 2/3 of the folks think that emotional support would be the most difficult to judge, and a little over half with the Danielson framework think instruction is the most difficult to judge. Drew, what do you find with the research? What does it tell us about this point?
Well, we're going to get to that.
Great.
So, but this is very good. Guys, this was just to sort of prompt the next discussion. Okay?
Great. Yeah. So at this point, we're going to move into a video. And so just stand by as the video loads, and we hope that you'll all be able to hear it and see it keep in mind this is about an 8-minute video. You're going to be seeing some classroom instruction, so Drew's going to give you a little more context about that, but I just want people to be aware that you will be watching the video for that period of time, so you won't be hearing us talk.
Right. So using a protocol means adopting a particular lens. It's asking people to judge teaching through the frame of that protocol, not just their own particular perspectives on teaching. Adopting a frame like this, it turns out, is not so easy. So I want to give you a sense about what's complicated about this, and so we'll give you this short snip of teaching. And I'm just going to ask you to judge 4 dimensions in the Danielson framework. The first come from the classroom environment domain, managing classroom procedures and managing student behavior. And the next 2 dimensions are from the instructional domain, using questioning and discussion techniques and engaging students in learning. So you've got the protocol, and the last page of the handout contains a notes page where you can type or write in notes about what you're observing, and I want you to focus on those aspects that are specific to these 4 dimensions. I want you to make a judgment about each of these 4 dimensions on this small clip of teaching. And take a few minutes to review the rubric on these 4 dimensions. So why don't you take a couple of minutes to do that? Right, so we are looking specifically at 2C, managing procedures, and I assume many of you are familiar with Danielson. There are the 4 levels: unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, and distinguished. 2D is managing student behavior, and then we're at 3B, which is using questioning and discussion techniques, and 3C, which is engaging students in learning. And obviously, if we were to do this in some sort of training, you would be spending a whole lot more time learning these different things. So this is just to give a taste. And what we're looking at is a video of teaching. So I'd like to give a quick plug to ETS for allowing me to do this. They've developed a very nice data set of videos that you can share with teachers and others in your setting and use for professional development. So I created an 8-minute clip of this talk, and we'll play the video, and you should take notes on things you see relevant to these 4 dimensions. And at the end of the video, I'll ask you to assign a rating of 1 to 4 on each dimension. And then we'll have a poll, and we'll see where the scores fall. Of course, this is just a short clip, and it's inappropriate to make any general claims about the teacher. All I'm asking you to evaluate is the quality of teaching you see during this 8 minutes according to your interpretation of the framework for the teaching rubric. So I think we're ready to go.
Share one portion with us. Colin, you want to go? Now, when Colin is sharing, think about your own writing. See if there's something you'd like to add to your writing when you hear his. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask him, maybe he needs to clarify something. I'll make an ethics lesson. Can you read that one more time? Remember, you're reading. And can you slow down just a little bit so we can hear you better? talking about the design solution paragraph. Can you read that one more time a little bit louder? Okay, and you might want to explain a little bit when you do more of your writing, a little bit more about that idea that you have. That's a good idea that I'm sure other people want to know about. Okay. Anybody else have a section that they want to read? Working awfully hard to say you want to share your section. So when you're able to get to your right, I think you should definitely put that in. And also when you see Dr. Haas, ask him about that nuclear reactors and how safe they would be on the moon. Because that is one of the forms of energy that they wanted to use, that NASA wanted to use to get energy on the moon. So ask him about the safety about that. Be very interesting to find out what he has to say. That's a good question to ask him too. He's an expert. He knows a lot more than we do. All right, boys, you guys did a nice job today. We're not done with this. We still have a lot more to do in preparation for our quiz on Friday. And I know that as the day goes on, like Carlos right now is adding some more thoughts to his paragraphs. I think that's a good idea. As you're going from station to station, if new ideas come, write them down. All right? Okay, thank you for pushing those chairs. Let's line up at the door, guys. Oh, sorry.
It looks like we're having a little technical difficulty with the video. Let's give it just a moment and see if we can get it up and running again.
0. All right, thank you for doing that so quickly and efficiently. Who would like to share a portion of their writing with us? I don't know if we have time to share all your writing, but who would like to share one portion with us? How want to go? Now, when Colin is sharing, think about your own writing. See if there's something you'd like to add to your writing when you hear his. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask him, maybe he needs to clarify. I'll make that for your reading. And you slow down just a little bit so we can hear you better. I'll make an epic buzz that has what very nice. I like that. So he's working on the section on design solution. Awesome. So are you Dr. Moss, ask him about that nuclear reactors and how safe they would be on the moon. Because that is one of the forms of energy that they wanted to use, that NASA wanted to use to get energy on the moon. So ask him about the safety about that. That would be very interesting to find out what he has to say. That's a good question to ask him too. He's an expert. He knows a lot more than we do. All right, boys, you guys did a nice job today. We're not done with this. We still have a lot more to do in preparation for our presentation on Friday. And I know that as the day goes on, like Carlos right now is adding some more thoughts to his paragraphs. I think that's a good idea. As you're going from station, if new ideas come, write them down. All right? Okay, thank you for pushing those chairs. Let's line up at the door, guys. Oh, sorry.
I'm off mute. Okay, so Elizabeth, are you gonna?
Yeah, so we have a few questions about the video now that you've been able to watch and follow along with the framework. We're going to be putting up 4 different pop-up screens with some questions, and your answer choices are listed below. Or actually, they're going to be in the poll. It'll be unsatisfactory, basic, proficient, or distinguished. And you're going to be rating these 4 categories, what you see on the screen currently: the teacher's management of classroom procedures, the teacher's management of student behaviors, the use of question and discussion techniques, and the engagement of students in learning. So first, just the teacher's management of classroom procedures. Okay, it looks like most people have had the opportunity to respond to the 4 questions, and now we'll start sharing the results. Drew, are you ready to talk about 4A?
Sure, and I think I just want, obviously this is not a forum to kind of have a discussion about what the right results are. The purpose of this was to essentially show how much variation there is, and admittedly, this is prior to any real training. I mean, you had, some of you may have gone through training on this sort of protocol, but you were essentially reading through a rubric in a rapid time and then giving your sense of the quality of teaching. I think, though, what this does get to is the immediate notion of, people know good teaching when they see it. And you can look at the variation here on every one of these dimensions, and you can say, boy, depending on who observed this teacher, the characterization of the quality of that teacher would vary quite substantially. In fact, on every dimension, 3 of the 4 score points are used, and some of them 4 are used. So it's quite variable. Things tended to cluster a little bit, but one of the interesting things is, well, how does all this stuff look like when you move to going to folks who've gone through significant training on these protocols. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to turn to that now, okay?
Great.
Okay. So this variation, it's not really unique, even among trained and practiced observers. So here's what we see. We know that instructional interactions are generally scored low, but were individual scores created by these raters accurate and reliable? So one way we studied this was by looking at agreement rates between two raters who scored the same lesson or portion of a lesson. And a large sample of video recordings of lessons were scored by two raters at different times, and we compared those scores to see if they gave the lesson the same score on a dimension. They agree if they gave exactly the same value, so they both scored it a 2, and they disagree if they gave it different scores. We checked dimension by dimension, and all of the raters that we included went through continued training and quality control. So every week they would look at a video and have a collective sort of standard setting where we would sort of calibrate and see if people were scored in line with a master coder, and we would discuss issues around that. So that, of course, is far more kind of quality control and training than you're going to see in a operational system in schools. So we regularly checked accuracy by comparing scores on lessons with experts on the same video, and we also looked at how they were doing compared to other raters when two raters scored these videos. And so we can get agreement rates of our raters and expert scores, and where we think these expert scores represent as close as we can to a gold standard. So these are ranges for agreement rates by dimensions within the domains. So on the left column is the agreements with other raters, two raters rating the same lesson, and on the right is agreements with the master coders doing these calibration exercises. And so for class, the agreement is generally low, except for a few dimensions in classroom organization. So the first 3 rows, if you look at classroom organization, there's some where there's a high level of agreement. And that's because there's very little variation on the scores, actually. And these agreement rates are similar whether we're considering agreement between two raters or between our raters and the experts. And so what that low agreement means is it'll matter which rater scores a lesson. A different rater, possibly on a different day, viewing a video will give the teaching a different score. Now the agreement rates for Danielson are a little bit higher, and this may largely be due to the fact that Danielson uses a 4-point scale. And it's clear even to the very poor raters that scores of 1 and 4 generally don't occur. So for Danielson, mostly deciding whether a task of picking between 2 and 3 it involves that sort of a task, and so agreement even there remains kind of low between that 2 and a 3. The 7-point scale for class inevitably will lead to more widely distributed scores and lower rates of absolute agreement. Now note that these record dimensions, the errors don't just average out, so that the average across domains would be more agreeable. Rater-to-rater variation is large, even at the domain average or total score average. Okay? Now, in these systems, as we calibrate raters, we know they have difficulty in making certain judgments. But does that change with experience and feedback, and for how long? Do we have a basis for saying that people are completely trained once they complete this initial training and calibration that people are going through across the country? Well, data suggests that when a rater did the scoring mattered for the teacher. Now recall, we scored videos, so when the scoring occurred was separate from when the lesson occurred. Because if we just look at live scoring, we have people getting more experience as they score, but the school year changing as well. So maybe teaching gets better or worse over the course of the school year. By disentangling this using the videos, we are actually looking at the quality of how people change in their scoring independent of when the lesson occurred. And so we could look at trends of how raters score teachers, and so this figure shows how raters would score the average teacher each day of scoring from the first day through a school year. The teaching is the same every day in this model. All that's changing is the scoring. And so early on, raters would score the average teacher very high, but that would change quickly as they did more scoring and were getting more training until about 100 days, and there they would score the average teacher about an entire point lower. Now that's a big change. An average teacher scored on the first day would score above the 75th percentile of all scores in the sample that we looked at, but scored around day 100, she'd score close to the 25th percentile. And we saw changes in scores even beyond the school year shown here, but the changes was much smaller as time went on, but they did not completely flatten out. We find similar patterns in CLAS and Danielson. They're not always as dramatic, and sometimes they come up more after about 100 days, but starting high and falling off is pretty consistent, except for the behavior management domain of CLAS. That starts high and stays high in our data. So when a teacher is scored can have a big impact, at least if raters are new. And from our studies, it could matter even if raters were experienced, but to a lesser degree. And the raters in these studies are getting regular feedback about the quality of scores, something not likely to happen nearly as frequently within operating systems. This lack of understanding of instruction as defined by the new protocols holds for teachers too. We ask teachers to rate themselves on the domains of class by identifying areas of strength and weakness. They systematically ranked on emotional instructional support and undervalued it on classroom organization. Teachers do not have an appreciation of their weakness on instruction and engagement of students. Relative to where we saw their weaknesses, they're overly focused on classroom behavior. Not only do teachers overvalue their instruction, they cannot differentiate who is high or lower. Teachers who rate themselves relatively high on instruction compared to other teachers are no more likely to be rated high by our observers than teachers who think they are weak on instruction. Now, these data come from the study by Courtney Bell and colleagues and is from an urban district where they observed and evaluated the principal training on the district version of this modified Danielson framework. Principals in training were similar to other raters I've described. They had weak agreement with experts. It's worth noting here that in this version of Danielson, the second domain, designing coherent instruction, refers to aspects of the classroom environment, whether students have tasks to work on, the degree to which the classroom is under control. You can see here that this is the place principals most agree with experts. For other domains, agreements with experts is much lower. They also do not agree with each other. Folklore holds that principals know good teaching when they see it, but our data suggests that folklore is wrong. They don't agree with each other on what good teaching is when they try to apply the Danielson protocol. If they all know good teaching when they see it, either truth is relative or it does not match Danielson's vision of good teaching. Like our raters, they have a sense of better or worse teaching, but they lack precision in scoring it. These experts, somebody asked what the qualifications of the experts were. These tended to be people who were part of the development team for the respective protocols. So these were people who worked in the University of Virginia shop, and they're the ones who regularly do training. They may have designed the system and regularly do training of people, and that was true actually in all cases. So these were the people who came close to be what we would define as experts in these protocols. Okay, Well, so it's pretty clear we have some work to do if we're going to both improve classroom interactions and improve our ability to make judgments about those interactions. And of course, these are highly interrelated issues. If people are not able to agree on what's entailed in good practice, then it's very difficult to imagine improving practice on any large scale. Okay, so given what I guess would be considered humbling data, how can we support productive interactions to improve the quality of teaching across the system? Surely we will not substantially reform education if our evaluation systems are limited to sorting teachers that identify 2% of people at the bottom end. These systems need to be designed to improve teaching, and there are lessons to be learned from inside and outside of education. For example, as Edward Deming described, quality organizations address performance issues as system problems, and the construction of system processes that actually increase quality and decrease variability in performance concurrently. So while so much of our current evaluation zeitgeist is focused on the identification of variation, one of the big takeaways from the work we've done is the relative homogeneity of practice. That what characterizes teaching is the sameness, not the variation. For example, do low-level questions characterize teaching across a system? What is the evidence across classrooms that students are engaged in problem solving about important ideas? And so it's important for systems to not simply identify outliers, but to understand the consistencies in teaching quality that call out for system action of one form or another. All the data we see from our research says that we really do need to improve the quality of interactions. This is not a matter of a very small percentage of classrooms being anything but proficient. In fact, we see that large proportions of classrooms have interactions that are modest and could stand improvement. And as we noted earlier, improvement may also require changes in curriculum and other instructional policies. If we're going to improve classroom interactions, we must treat this as a systems issue and not as a problem of outliers. There are a number of things that I think we could be doing, and some of these run counter to current law, policy, and directives about teacher evaluations. But there's research that needs to be paid attention to if we're going to have effective systems. For example, we know from work in performance evaluation that simply assigning people scores that put them into categories or bins is actually counterproductive. It results in lower performance and weaker organizational commitment. What is effective is specific feedback that people can act upon. Of course, this implies that such feedback must be accurate and useful, and once again calls out the importance of making accurate interpretations during observation. And yet so many of our systems, indeed driven by the race to the top effort, mandates classification of individuals into categories. Specific feedback is not mandated. As we noted earlier, the new evaluation systems are in a context where historically no one receives low scores. This may be because people don't really understand the low levels of instruction we see, or because the focus is on classroom management, which is generally higher. It may also be due to a culture of nice in teaching, or the general tendency for performance evaluations to be skewed high, not only in teaching but in all fields, or because of the specific incentives in the current system do not encourage or discourage principals from giving poor performance ratings. Regardless, historically they are high, but that is inconsistent with our research data that values, especially for instruction. So we can look at data from emerging systems, and these are pilot systems that are pilot studies that are going on in states, to see how things are unfolding in the field in actual practice outside of these research studies. And is this changing, in fact, the distribution of scores so that people are not all considered to be above average, as we saw in the widget report? Well, these data suggest that efforts to generate quality evaluations may not be succeeding. So in the example here, we're looking at the Danielson data on the left from research studies, and this is a composite of different research studies. And then we have a protocol, a Danielson derivative used in the Georgia study. These data, though, are completely representative of other data we're seeing emerging in other state pilot efforts. So in this study, 94% of teachers in Georgia received proficient or exemplary ratings on the state's TAPS observation measure. The most striking difference between this and the research data is that with Danielson, when we look at it in research studies, the vast majority of teachers receive a score of 2, and no teachers are in the distinguished level 4. In this pilot study, principals are rate 74% of teachers proficient and 19% exemplary. And we don't think the intention of Georgia as a state was to define teaching differently than what Danielson had done. As I said, these results are not unique. The data emerging from other states show similar skew in initial principal evaluations, and anecdotes from other states also report similar findings. Even if we can train principals to rate accurately and reliably in training exercises, we must question whether they will do so without a broader change to the education culture and the system of evaluation. There's also a larger issue of how policy can undermine the use of protocols. Many states treat a lower rating, one that is indicative of needing improvement, as a driver of some type of employment-related action. Hence, administrators will likely be hesitant to put large proportions of teachers on watch. Saying that 75% of your teachers are subject to being removed from the job is not a great way to cultivate a healthy workplace. Indeed, if scores were assigned in ways similar to scores from research studies, over 50% would be rated as needing improvement. So we have a situation where the protocols say that legitimately instruction inside the districts that have been studied needs improvement at a broad scale. Yet we have evaluation policies that treat those needing improvement as performers in need of employment action. So what this disconnect means is that in practice, we designate most teachers and teaching as proficient, and that doesn't align with criterion reference, non-consequential assessments of teaching. So how do we get improvement if we see teaching that needs improvement and we call it proficient? How do we create the continuous improvement in a system that has policies that encourage people to say that most everything is fine? Well, we've learned a few things from our studies. First, much of teaching is quite modest relative to how these new observation systems define quality teaching. And certainly that finding is consistent with studies of classrooms that have been conducted over the last several decades. We can go back to John Goodlad, for example. Classrooms do not provide rich opportunities for learning. Yes, students are well behaved and classrooms are well organized, but there's very little evidence of sustained and high levels of interaction around interesting and important ideas. Part of the challenge in addressing this issue is that educators, teachers, and administrators need a better sense of what high-quality instruction looks like. They seem to have a better understanding of whether students are on task and well behaved. But converging sources of data, including this research and work by others, tells us that we do not have anything close to a shared understanding of what it means, for example, to engage students in problem solving, to inquire and probe content deeply, and to elicit and act on student understanding. And so without this shared understanding, we not only will have problematic scores on observations, but we will not have the capacity to actually improve the system. A signal of this lack of understanding is that the scores we see in emerging states and districts are almost uniformly inflated. If we take the message from the Widget report, what we may be identifying is a continued unwillingness of principals and other administrators to call out for performance. And we think there's no doubt some truth to that, although one could argue that there are some actually useful organizational issues for adopting such a stance. But our data suggests that these high scores are not simply a matter of lack of willingness to identify poor teaching. They also reflect a lack of capacity to make such judgments. To be explicit, if a principal is only confident and able to make judgments about dimensions related to classroom organization, then our data suggests that in fact most classrooms look pretty good. And if they are unable to differentiate teachers on other aspects of instruction, then they may simply generalize from classroom organization dimensions to other dimensions. And so how do we improve things? To develop observation systems and the capacity to execute systems that will result in more effective teaching and learning, I want to offer two sets of suggestions. The first of which includes suggestions for refining the basic architecture of systems that are now being developed and implemented. And the second set of suggestions includes some thoughts on how we might think about some more significant restructuring of these systems and how they're implemented. Surely we can improve on different aspects of these systems, but that does not come for free, nor do we see it as likely given the demands placed on current administrative structures in schools. Being able to coordinate multiple observations using multiple observers for all teachers can be simply staggering for many systems with limited capacity. Interestingly, some of the model efforts that have received a good deal of public attention, including the work of the District of Columbia, have done so with the infusion of significant funds to build the capacity of systems to undertake this work. Now, whether systems can do the same within existing operations is an open question. But systems do need to be developed and improved, and we are seeing increasingly the development of tools to support this kind of work. If the resources are available, these changes can be made within the structures of emerging evaluation systems. The fundamental challenges facing policymakers and practitioners alike is whether observational systems, such as these, can be modified in such a way. The second set of suggestions is focused on processes that can support productive interactions to improve the quality of teaching across the system. Surely we will not substantially reform education if our evaluation systems are limited to sorting teachers that identify 2% of people at the bottom end. These systems need to be designed to improve teaching, and there are lessons to be learned. As Edward Demings describes, quality organizations address performance issues as system problems. And I mentioned that we need to move towards systems that begin to do that and treat these as system problems and looking at performance across the institutions rather than simply looking at variation amongst individuals. And then we need to have performance systems in which there is trust and shared accountability. So the peer assistance and review program from Montgomery County in Maryland provides us with one such model. When decisions about a teacher need to be made, a group of teachers and administrators collectively participate in those decisions, so they are not seen as arbitrary or capricious. Teachers are not simply the objects of evaluation, they participate in the process. And engaging in such a process, of course, challenges many existing assumptions held by administrators and professional associations alike. Finally, if we're to build institutional capacity, it's important that evaluation not be a private enterprise. Having two independent observers review and discuss an observation is not simply a way to measure inter-rater reliability. That's why we use co-observers and not multiple raters. It offers the potential to have another mechanism that can support development of a shared understanding of teaching quality across the system. So there are ways to make classroom observations an important part of school improvement, but doing so will not be easy. So let's see. I'm sorry. Oops. So I began this talk by claiming we need to think about the role of all educators in the system when we think about improving teaching. And that's because observations are not simply a tool to judge teachers. They're a structure in which all stakeholders together can develop a common understanding and common language to talk about aspects of teaching that are seldom discussed. When we see low agreement rates, that is far more than a problem of measurement. It is a flag that people do not have such a shared understanding and will take hard work to get there. We've learned a great deal about observations during the last few years, and we have much more to learn. We know for sure it is hard work and challenges fundamental understanding of teaching, evaluation, and leadership. These systems are new and fragile, and they can be tremendous resources, or they can be treated as a bureaucratic hurdle to be completed. There will need to be continuous monitoring of and research about these systems as they get implemented. And these results need to feed back into policy so that appropriate direction can be given to help evaluations using observation reach their promise. So thank you, and I will hand this over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Drew. That was so informative. I think along with all the participants, we learned a lot today about the quality of interactions, and we still have a little bit more talking to do. We have quite a few questions that came in during the registration process, so we'll get to those shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to take the opportunity to talk to participants about what action steps you all are planning to take as a result of what you heard today in today's webinar. So we're going to open up another open-ended poll, and we'd love for you to share some of your ideas for putting this, what you've heard today, into action in your setting or in the work that you do. David's multitasking. He's getting emails out and making change happen. That's amazing. We are at this critical juncture where districts, states are all focusing on this and looking at their observation system, looking at their evaluation system, and it is a point in time where people are looking at new and different ways to do things and to get the most out of the tools that we have and the data we're collecting. So we're hoping that people will do something with this information, take it back, share it, and think about how to apply it to your systems. I see Claire is mentioning that she's going to share it with others in the teacher education program. I know we have quite a few university folks that have been attending these webinars, and this is good information for those who are preparing teachers and getting teachers prepared for what they might expect when they get to the classroom. Drew, do you have anything to add about that with respect to higher education and how they can use this information?
Well, I know that we're pushing on this in a few ways, actually, at Rutgers. We're doing some piloting. One is to actually have, to try to apply some of this within within our community as teachers of students, with the notion that, one, because all of our students are going to be subject to this, we ought to have a pretty deep understanding of what this means, both the cognitive and emotional dimensions of sort of having people come in and look at your teaching and make some comments and ratings on that. And so we're doing a bit of that, but we are also moving to have adopt these systems as part of the training of teachers so that they understand how they will be evaluated, and hopefully, you know, we can do these in productive ways so that these can be done well, you know, that we have groups of people coming out who are both teachers and administrators who have an understanding of what it would mean to do these things well. And we're a long way from doing that, but I think to the extent that higher ed can do this, it would be a good thing rather than simply sort of being sort of victims of poor implementation. So to try to create models of good practice would be very useful.
Yeah, it looks like we've had quite a few comments related to that preparation of pre-service teachers, and you know, you added in that piece of administrators. I think, you know, it would be wise for people to take this information and incorporate it into their programs and developing new teachers and new principals.
Right. Now, I did get a question. Robert asked a question about how long the time elapsed should be between recording an observation and evaluating it, or evaluating a teacher. I think there's a big difference between what we did in a research study where we could record the video and then look at it a year later, because we were just assigning scores. We weren't trying to, we weren't giving feedback to specific teachers or anything like that. I mean, we were just trying to look at relationships among different measures and the quality of different measures. So it's a very different thing. I think you want to do it in as timely a way as possible because if you have the video, it certainly enables you to go back and look at things in certain ways. But I think you'd like it to affect the practice, and you'd like people, if they're going to be evaluated, to feel that the information has some currency.
Yeah, I was going to add to that and say that to me it's similar to formative assessment in the instructional practice, that as administrators or observers, we want to provide that feedback to teachers as soon as possible so they can improve their instruction, make changes that will then influence the teaching that's happening in the classroom pretty quickly and can actually take action on that. Lots of great ideas coming in about the actions, and we encourage you to follow up and start doing some of these things. And as I'll discuss a little bit towards the end, is that we have these teacher effectiveness forums, and we'd love for you to all come back, in the next week, in the next month, and continue the conversation about this and share with us how it's going as you implement these steps and start to try some of these things. And you may find that there are others out there who are making similar attempts or trying different things that you can learn from. So one of our goals with this series is to engage all of you with one another and provide you with a lot of information to think about and consider how to apply to your setting, and then to come back and kind of brainstorm and talk to us about the application and how implementation is going. So I would encourage you to consider coming back to the forum for that purpose over the coming weeks and months.
Right. I see there are some questions on sort of how do you build a more trusting community in the schools. And I think to begin with, if there's not a community of trust to begin with, I don't think the evaluation process is going to solve that problem. But you don't want it to compromise it either. I think it's like any sort of trust-building enterprise, things need to be explicit, they need to be clear, people need to have voice. There are some models that are being developed, I know, with significant teacher participation. I think those are the ones where there's the most trust there, because if you're in a system where it's just done to you and you're not part of it, it's very difficult to imagine a fully trusting environment. But that, if teaching is going to move into a full profession, that's one of the hallmarks of full professions, is that you sort of evaluate your own. And that challenges our traditional notions of labor management on both ends. And I think when I think of the most productive sorts of models, and the ones that would also provide for more capacity to actually engage in things, it's those models. And the other real positive to that is that you would then also have a greater likelihood of people who understood the content that was being taught actually evaluating those teachers. One of the weaknesses in the current model is that you often have administrators evaluating teachers who have very little grasp of the content that's being taught, and therefore are looking at much more superficial characteristics of the teaching than somebody who has a deeper understanding of the content. And so by involving teachers in that process, I think you do a better job. And it's not to say that there aren't certain teachers that need to be not teaching, but at the end of the day, if we're going to move our system, it's really improving the folks who are there and having the will to remove teachers who shouldn't be, small number of teachers who shouldn't be teaching, but then figuring out how to remove the system to, as Deming said, have actually less variation and more high quality, and that's going to require a collaborative effort.
Thanks, Drew. I know people are still kind of considering their action steps, but we're also going to jump into more of the questions that you all posed, and I know there have been some questions, and Drew's been answering those, but we're going to actually pull this pod out, the poll that's currently there, and put up a new Q&A poll, and I have a few questions that I'm going to start with because we had so many that came in on the registration site. So I'll start with, have others, please feel free to ask those in the Q&A box that comes up. But Drew, one of the things that someone was asking about is in reference to teachers monitoring student-to-student interactions. So moving a little bit away from the teacher to the student and thinking about how can teachers best monitor student-to-student interactions and manage or prevent undesirable behavior, such as bullying, putting other students down, those types of behaviors that happen in the classroom and can really take away from the instructional process.
Yeah, I bet you have other people that can answer that a whole lot better than me. That are amongst this group. You know, I don't feel equipped to really answer that.
Okay, that's fair enough. And you know, I think that as we kind of investigate some of the other topics, that's something we could probably circle back to in our next round of the series. But certainly, administrators alike would agree that this is an issue for them and how to manage classrooms and ensure that that learning is happening. So we'll be sure to circle back to that one. We have several other questions related to specific ways, specific strategies for promoting positive interactions for students of certain groups, so English learners, students with disabilities. To your knowledge, is there any specific research focused on teachers' interactions with groups of students like that?
There's a little bit, but I actually think that's a gaping hole. If you, particularly these general rubrics, these general protocols, they talk about being sensitive to learners, to being sensitive to learners' needs, whether it's learning needs, cultural background, that sort of thing. But they haven't fully explicated that sort of thing, so that what it really means is it's up to the knowledge that the observer brings to into the situation, that in interpreting and enriching what that general guideline means. So, in fact, we're hoping to maybe do some work in the idea of what does it mean to engage in culturally relevant pedagogy, and how could you elaborate on that? We're also doing work in subject-specific areas. So, you know, it's one thing to say we're engaged in strong, you know, high-quality reasoning or high-quality questioning, but what does that really mean in a science classroom versus an English language arts classroom? And we need to clarify that as you go into these subject-specific protocols, like the math and language arts protocols I referenced. They start unpacking this a lot more. You still come up with a general sense of quality, and even, but you don't have that sort of deeper, nuanced sense of what contributes to that quality and what would I do instructionally. And I think the same thing holds if we're looking at special ed or ELLs or you know, all sorts of other populations. We don't really have strong languages or strong methods for observing those kinds of classrooms. In fact, there have been some attempts to look at sort of teaching to support ELLs within, a diverse classroom, and it's very difficult to make those judgments, we found, or others have found, because the moves often are so subtle that you're really calling on observers to be very sensitive to what that means in terms of how teachers may use language or supports to support English language development. It's just a difficult thing to track. So we need to make significant progress on that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Clearly people are interested in that and want some information about how to do that. So there's an area for research for folks who are looking for something. Another set of questions came in related to creating the right culture for this type of work where we're looking at classrooms, improving quality of interactions as a piece, not of an evaluation system, but just something that's happening regularly in our schools, in our classrooms for improvement. And do you have any suggestions about how people can create that culture, both as teachers, administrators, working in schools?
Well, I think there's models, there's leadership, there's creating environments where people try things and see the value that they get out of that sort of thing. I mean, teachers are, by and large, committed. They want to see their kids learning. They want to see them engaged in ways that I think we'd all agree are productive. And so I think they would need to be able to be in places where they can try these things out and see valued outcomes emerge. But that means being in an environment where they can try some things. Some things may not work the first time. They can look at colleagues who try these sorts of things. I mean, I don't think there's any magical situation there, but you also need to have situations where policy and directives aren't in conflict with that. I mean, if you're in an environment where you're saying we need to do all these things, and then on the other hand, the message is, and you need to make sure you cover all these chapters by this date certain, it creates a conflict where people are going to try to satisfy one mandate or another, and if they're in conflict, they'll pick the one they see having the greatest reward. So you want to create systems where there's a consistent sort of message, and I think that ultimately is a leadership issue.
Yeah, I was going to point out that same thing, is that we need kind of a synergy in messaging about, it's okay to take risks, we can say out of one side of our mouth, but then we have this other message that, well, you need to take risks within the confines of this structure and this approach. And so I think teachers and administrators do struggle with that and wanting to do the right thing, but feeling so much pressure about the mandates and the requirements that are oftentimes in conflict. So I'm glad you brought that up. You actually tied into the next question I was going to ask regarding administrators, and this question is in particular to what kind of administrative support do you think is needed for teachers to be able to improve the quality of their classroom interactions? So beyond the observation, what are things administrators can do to support teachers in improving the way they interact with students in the classroom?
Well, I think a couple of things. One thing, and I think this is partially related to a question Michelle asks here, which is how do you align PD with to support the success of teachers? And this goes back to this issue of looking at these things as systems problems. The fact is, if we're looking at questioning and discussion, and a lot of people said this is something to look at, and we see that questioning and discussion is relatively low across the school, across the district, then let's address that as how can we support questioning and discussion? And some of that is maybe about curriculum materials. Some of that is around policy, instructional policies. A lot of that is in terms of our assessment practices and teacher interactions. But can you sort of say, we're going to really focus on this dimension as a problem for the system that we want to improve in a multifaceted way, which is a very different approach than coming into a single teacher or many single teachers and say, you know, can you get your questioning up? And so I think that's one of the tricks for the alignment, is pick the spots where you can really focus the energies of people collectively on improving things to work together to improve that, and to treat it not just as a people problem, but as a system problem, and what would it take to improve the system. And I think almost inevitably, it's not just a problem of what the teacher does. There's also a whole lot of other things that would affect that as well. So I let's see. What was the other part of that question? I'm sorry.
I think you answered mine. I think we have quite a few other questions. I don't know that we'll get to all of them. And just so everyone on the call knows, we'll be putting together a Q&A document after today's webinar, compiling all the responses that Drew's provided on the questions that were asked, and all the ones that we haven't been able to respond to will be included there with some responses as well. And you can find that Q&A document on the Rel Mid-Atlantic website. Once you get the follow-up email, you'll have the link to that information, and you should see that in about the next week or so, as well as going back to any of our prior webinar archives, and you can see that similar information for all the others. So at this time, Drew, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave folks with before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I don't think so. I think I've yapped enough at it, folks. So, you know, in terms of, you know, it is sort of an irony focusing on interactions where I don't have anybody talking to me. Nobody, it's a wide audience, not talking. So, or, you know, being able to sort of see people's eyes and faces. Anyway, I don't have any brilliant summary statement here.
Well, I think you shared a lot of really valuable information with the group today, and I can see from the questions that have come in and all of the responses to the different questions that they're all thinking about this and really taking a lot away, and I hope they would all agree. We're going to go through a few final slides with some housekeeping information, but before I do that, I would love to give Drew a virtual round of applause and thank you for your time today and sharing this great information with the group we have here.
Well, thank you for all the questions and comments. It's a neat experience.
And as you can see on the current slide, you can find out more about Drew's program at Rutgers through that website. And the next slide has our contact information. I know someone was interested in being in touch with Drew with some additional questions, and I'm sure he'd be willing to respond if you email him. And if you have any other general questions about the Teacher Effectiveness Series or about the work that the Rel Mid-Atlantic does, feel free to email me or Teresa Duncan.